Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, everyone's wondering what the meta healers are going to be for the next expansion, and often it's cited the utility and what they bring to the table and how good it is being the number one reason for why you'd bring a healer. And I wanted to have a little bit of a challenge to that, because while utility, and what we mean by that is dispels, damage reduction, your crowd control you bring to the table, tank externals, all of those things. While that is insanely important, there's also areas where output, the healing, the damage that you do can actually outweigh the utility that a spec brings to the table. And I think at present that Preservation Evoker, after it's gotten some notable changes to its life bind and what actually reflects in life bind, being able to stasis, things like engulf, and other buffs it's gotten over the course of beta, it is doing insanely large amounts of healing. And as a result of this, I think there's an argument to be made that if Preservation's numbers stay very highly tuned, it could be run as a meta healer in Mythic Plus alongside Augmentation, even if there's a utility overlap. People always say is like, oh, Preservation's good and does all these kind of things, but like it overlaps with Aug, and so as a result, you're not going to bring it. And to this, I want to counter that, okay? Because while utility is very important, and we're going to have a section talking all about it and how great it is, you can, I believe, outweigh the value of utility if it's insanely high enough, okay? So what's a good example of that? Mistweaver in Season 3 of Dragonflight. In that season, you were running Vengeance Demon Hunter comps with Aug, Mage, and Shadow Priest. And you were having a higher representation of Mistweaver monks to run with that composition at 0.1% title, the elite level, and at key levels 30 and above. So even higher than the 0.1% titles. Mistweaver was higher represented than Restoration Druid. Now, Mistweaver has, notably some good utility. They've got their stun, they've got Ring of Peace. The Cocoon was insanely powerful at that point in time. Their defenses were phenomenal. But when looking at things like Mystic Touch for a Vengeance Demon Hunter Aug Mage Shadow Priest comp, it really was not that effective. That entire comp wasn't really hurting super heavily for like stuns. With the amount of shutdowns that Vengeance Demon Hunter had at the time, they weren't really hurting for crowd control, stops, things along those lines. They were fine. Mistweaver was blasting so much healing that it made up for its less than good utility, and as a result, they were higher represented than Druid, which had very good utility, very good output. While high output can also mean high representation, low output can also mean very low representation, okay? Because in that exact same season, Season 3 of Dragonflight, you can see the charts. Big thank you to Banshee IRL on Twitter for all these charts that we're going to be using. You could also see that Paladin, while it was at 88.5% representation of all of the title level healers on NA and EU, in Season 2, it fell off a freaking cliff in Season 3 and Season 4, going down to 1.8% and then down to 0.78%, the lowest represented healer in Season 4. The lowest represented class, I should say, for healers in Season 4. And that is a direct result of its output being so low. The spec historically has insane levels of utility, but when it gets nerfed enough, then that means that they're not going to have as easy of a time healing through mistakes, healing through some of the more stressful encounters, and as a result, you see the representation of a spec fall through the floor. Dragonflight notably is an expansion that's had some really huge swings in balance just in general. You had moments where Holy Paladin was annihilating everybody in terms of its HPS, or Mistweaver was annihilating everyone in terms of its HPS. You even had Preservation Evoker in Season 1 of Dragonflight crushing HPS meters. You could see on our chart, they were the third most represented title level healer. But then after a lot of the insanity with how Lifebind ramps were working at that time, they got nerfed along with some other nerfs for the spec, and they never really recovered. At best, after Season 1, they got to almost 2% of title level key healers. And in a raid environment, they were never as highly represented in high-end raiding, Race to World First content as they were in the first season of Dragonflight. Output makes a massive difference on the meta, and it's why numbers at the last possible second can make all the difference in the world. Now, output doesn't necessarily mean healing, okay? But usually it does. Back in Shadowlands, we were able to see enormously high representation for Resto Shaman, in large part in thanks to their Vesper Totem dealing crazy amounts of damage, because the meta in Shadowlands dungeons was all about healer DPS. A lot of the dungeons, especially when we go back to Necrotic Wake or Mist of Tirnasai, you're going to see that a lot of those dungeons, you can just sit back and do huge damage. The healer checks are not as high. The stress for the healers to heal through certain mechanics or miss kicks is not as high as other dungeons. They're usually just, you kick, you stop the enemy, and you're going to kill it pretty quickly and easily. And that's why for certain seasons or even entire expansions, the meta can start shifting representation towards another part of the toolkit. Dragonflight was very much about just being able to out-heal and out-muscle issues and survive, whereas Shadowlands was more about healer damage because the bosses and the trash mobs have so much health, and the healer checks were notably much less than what they were in Dragonflight, putting more pressure on the damage aspect, less on the survivability aspect. Remember, there's two nodes when you have your Mythic plus affix. You have the damage of the monsters and the health of the monsters. For Shadowlands, it was all about the health, Dragonflight, and it looks like the War Within is going to be all about the damage. Now, this is not to say that utility is worthless, and that's not the point I want to get across onto this. It's that over a long period of time, utility looks to be king, but in what I would call the micro situations, a season by season thing, you can actually find a number of areas where just output can be king for a specific season if the imbalance is really high. Another chart by Banshee, thank you again, shows the cumulative representation of all healers from Legion all the way. I think this chart ends in season 2 of Dragonflight. So just around the time Paladin was getting insane. So as you can see from this chart, right as we hit the end of it, you can see historically massive representation for Resto Druids and Holy Paladins, in large part because of how powerful their kits were for very long periods of time. So when output, healing or damage or whatever is well balanced, then the healers that have utility are historically going to get the highest representation or very high representation throughout a season. And then the other healers that are going to be around there that don't have that sort of kit that a druid or a paladin has most of the time, and you can kind of lump shaman into it now that it has a raid buff as well. The other healers that don't have that sort of representation, priest, mistweaver, I think you can even argue evoker as well, they are going to be more dependent on having really high output in one way or another. We saw, as I mentioned before, Shaman did massive damage in Shadowlands, and that's what led to a lot of their representation. But also at the end of the expansion, healer priests with the Fey Guardians from the Covenant ability and insane output from Power Infusion synergizing with mages also led to a huge representation for them in Season 3 and Season 4. So there's more than one way for output really to be represented over a long period of time, but utility over the wide course of multiple expansions in the entire time of M+, is winning out in the long run. In the short term, on a season-by-season basis, if a spec is too highly tuned, it can outweigh their lack of utility and lead to them being insanely highly represented for a season. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the point that if Preservation or any other healer at this point has enough output and looks like they are just blasting HPS and they don't get nerfed after a heroic week, then that means that they could very easily see incredibly high representation in both high-end rating and in high-end Mythic Plus. If you see a healer that is just bodying everybody, that could always be a safe selection for pushing up high keys or in rating, because it often takes Blizzard a very long time for them to properly balance some of the insanity that healers have. The ridiculous season for Paladin lasted, half a season since it got implemented mid-season, but about half a season. Mistweaver Monk, it lasted an entire season. Same thing with Preservation Evoker. It usually lasted an entire season. And so these are things to watch for at the beginning of an expansion, is that they usually don't nerf these kind of things overnight after the heroic week's end. Mistweaver did actually get a couple nerfs after Amirdasil had ended, and it still didn't really do a lot to move the needle and to hurt its representation. And so some of the key questions that we also have is, why does it take so long, really? If The output leads to such incredible changes in the meta and shifts into the meta, regardless of the overall design of a spec, regardless of the overall utility that they bring to the table. Why aren't there faster changes to balance to be able to address this? Furthermore, if I'm correct, an output can outweigh utility if it's extreme enough, then why aren't certain healers that lack utility, historically, given some kind of utility tool, the way like Holy Priest was for raiding for a while with Symbol of Hope? Or why are they not balanced to have enough healing to address that lack of utility? Why aren't they trying to make those things happen to further shake up the meta or to have things sort of well represented? One thing I did leave out in this video is how tank balance can also lead to a better healer variety, and maybe that'll be another video for another time, but I think that is extremely true because tank players can kind of build and form their own groups as long as they are all well balanced. That leads to a good diversity of comps, kind of like what we saw in Dragonflight Season 1, which was fantastic. And so my closing thought is this: if things are staying the same with Preservation Evoker, they are the healer to watch for the next expansion. Maybe like I would call it the dark horse for the next expansion. That if their output stays high or some incoming tuning notes are going to be changing and causing maybe another healer like Mistweaver Monk to rise once again in terms of crazy high output, those can be strong enough to outweigh their lack of utility that historically strong specs like Paladin and Druid have, and could be higher represented in the long term. So utility, while it's super important, especially from a macro sense and a long-term sense, from a micro with an incoming season, some healers, especially if they just blast enough healing, could be outweighing that. We are, of course, going to be making tier lists as we get closer, but it's always, like I said, something to think about going forward when you're choosing your healer main. Is that utility matters a lot, but HPS does as well. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Huge thank you to our patrons who make all of this content possible. Let me know what some of your thoughts or maybe even concerns are for healers going into the new expansion down in the comments down below, and I'll catch you all next time.